There is a particular kind of man who will quietly destroy himself for the people he loves, not because he is weak, but because he loves too hard and thinks too little of himself to believe he deserves to be loved back without first earning it. Paul Seaman was that kind of man. He did not fall apart dramatically. He did not make speeches or demand recognition. He simply woke up one day, decided that the mother of his son needed saving, and then spent the next 730 days slowly grinding himself down a bone in silence, never once knowing that every single day of that suffering was a test someone else had designed, scored, and was quietly grading from a comfortable office chair. Before we continue, we'd love to know where you're watching from. Seeing how far our stories travel reminds us that meaningful storytelling knows no borders. To understand what Paul Seaman did and why he did it, you first need to understand what kind of man he was before Diana Lucas walked out of his life. Paul was not a complicated man by nature. He was a kind of person who paid his bills on time, remembered birthdays, and genuinely believed that if you work hard enough and kept your promises, the world would eventually reward you with some form of peace. He grew up watching his father hold down 2 jobs without complaint, and he absorbed that lesson the way children absorb most things, silently, completely, and without fully understanding the cost. He was an accountant by profession, which suited him. He liked numbers because numbers did not lie. You added them up, and they either balanced or they did not. There was no gray area in a spreadsheet. There was no room for emotion or misunderstanding. A column either reconciled or it did not. And if it did not, you went back and found the error and you fixed it. Paul wished many times in his life that people worked the same way. His marriage to Diana had not been a bad one, at least not entirely. They had met in their late 20s at a work conference, and there had been something real between them in those early years, a genuine warmth, a shared sense of humor, a feeling that they were building something together. They had John when they were both 31. And for a while, the 3 of them had been a family in all the ways that mattered. But somewhere along the way, Paul and Diana had developed 2 completely different definitions of what the word provider meant. To Paul, providing meant financial stability. It meant never being in debt, always having savings, always being prepared for the unexpected. He was not greedy with his money. He was afraid of losing it. There was a difference, though Diana never quite saw it that way. To Diana, providing meant presence. It meant choosing people over percentages. She wanted a husband who would, occasionally, spend a little recklessly just to create a memory, who would book the holiday they couldn't quite afford, who would say, "We'll figure out," rather than, "Let's check the budget first." She did not think she was asking for too much. Paul did not think he was giving too little. And in that gap between what each of them believed was reasonable, their marriage quietly fell apart. The divorce was not explosive. It was a slow, civil, incredibly sad process in which 2 people who still respected each other came to mutual conclusion that they had become strangers who shared a child and a mortgage. They divided their assets fairly. They agreed on joint custody of John. They agreed to be decent to each other for their son's sake. And for several years after the divorce was finalized, they managed to hold up that agreement with a kind of exhausted professionalism. John was 12 when his parents separated. By the time he turned 18 and left for university, he had grown up watching his parents operate in a careful, courteous distance. Never warm, never hostile, just managed. He loved both of them. He had learned, as children of divorced parents often do, to hold his love in 2 separate compartments and never try to merge them. Paul, in the years after the divorce, had continued to pay regular child support, had attended every important event in John's life, and had done his best to remain a consistent presence even when consistency required real sacrifice. He was not a perfect father. He was a distracted one, sometimes prone to letting work swallow too many evenings, prone to the same financial caution that had slowly killed his marriage. But he showed up. Whatever else could be said about Paul Seaman, he showed up, and it was precisely because Diana knew this about him, because she had watched him for over a decade and understood the mechanics of his love, that she chose him for her experiment. It started on a Tuesday evening in October, about 6 months after John had begun his 2nd year at university. Paul was at his apartment, going through quarterly tax reports, when his phone rang. It was Diana. They still spoke occasionally, usually about John, logistics, mostly. He answered without concern. What he heard in her voice stopped him. She sounded shaken, not dramatically, not in the way of someone performing distress, but in the way of someone who was trying very hard to hold themselves together and was only barely managing it. She told him that she had lost her job, that the company had gone through a round of redundancies, and her position had been eliminated. She told him she had 2 months of savings left, maybe 3 if she stretched it carefully, but that her rent was due and she was already behind on 2 utility bills, and she did not know what she was going to do. Paul listened to all of it without interrupting. He heard the pauses in her voice. He heard what sounded like a suppressed tremor when she mentioned John's name, how she did not want John to find out, how she did not want her son spending the most important years of his education worrying about whether his mother had a roof over her head. Paul heard all of that, and something in his chest tightened in a way that it always did when the people he loved were in trouble. He did not ask her many questions. He probably should have. He should have asked her which company, who her manager was, when exactly the redundancy had occurred, whether she had begun looking for other work, whether she had contacted the relevant employment agencies, whether she had spoken to anyone else about her situation. An accountant, of all people, should have known to ask for documentation, for details, for something verifiable. But Paul was not thinking like an accountant that evening. He was thinking like a man who had once loved this woman, who still felt the weight of their shared history, who could hear the strain in her voice, and who could not separate that strain from the memory of what it had meant to be her husband. He was thinking about John, sitting in a university lecture hall with absolutely no idea that his mother was struggling. He was thinking about what it would do to John to find out. He was thinking about what it would mean for a 19-year-old boy to carry that weight during the years that were supposed to be the foundation of his future. Paul told Diana not to worry. He told her he would figure something out. He hung up the phone and sat in the quiet of his apartment for a long time, and then he started doing calculations in his head. The problem was not simply one of money. Paul had some savings, but not enough to comfortably absorb Diana's rent on top of his own expenses for an indefinite period. And he understood almost immediately that indefinite was the right word for it. Losing a job did not come with a timetable. He could not know when she would find new work. He could not know how long this would last. The other problem was Diana's pride. He knew her well enough to understand that she would not accept help that felt like charity, and she would certainly not accept it if it felt like Paul was positioning himself as a rescuer. She had spent years building her independence after their marriage ended. She would not want to take money from her ex-husband in a way that felt like she was going backward. So Paul did something that, in retrospect, was either incredibly thoughtful or incredibly foolish, depending on how you looked at it. He called an old friend of his named Marcus, a man who had worked in local government for years and had a suitably official-sounding manner of speaking. Paul explained the situation to Marcus and asked him a favor. He asked Marcus to pose as a housing assistance officer from a fictional government subsidy program, something Paul invented on the spot and named the Community Housing Stability Fund. The idea was simple. Marcus would contact Diana, explain that her address had been flagged as eligible for a temporary housing support grant, and inform her that for the duration of her unemployment, a portion of her rent would be covered by this program. No repayment required. Government funded. Completely standard procedure. Marcus thought Paul had lost his mind. He told him so, directly and with some emphasis. He pointed out at least 4 ways in which this plan was unnecessarily complicated, and at least 2 ways in which it could backfire spectacularly. Paul listened to all of Marcus's objections and then asked him again, more quietly this time, if he would do it. Marcus looked at his friend, at the tight set of his jaw and the heaviness in his eyes, and said yes. The call was made. Diana, to her credit, was skeptical at first. She asked Marcus several questions about the program, about eligibility criteria, about what documentation she would need to provide. Marcus answered everything smoothly and professionally, because Marcus was a man who had spent 20 years in rooms where official-sounding language was a primary currency, and he was very good at it. By the end of the conversation, Diana had agreed to accept the assistance. She told Paul about it the next day, almost as an aside. She said it was strange timing, but that she supposed these things happened, that sometimes the right help came along at the right moment. She said it with a lightness in her voice that made Paul feel, for the first time in a long time, that he had done something genuinely good. He had no way of knowing that Diana had recognized Marcus's voice immediately. She had met Marcus twice at Paul's work functions during their marriage. She had a good memory for voices. It was one of the things Paul had always admired about her, and she knew, from the moment Marcus said his third sentence, exactly who she was talking to. She knew the program was fiction. She knew Paul was behind it, and she made a decision in that moment that would shape the next 2 years of both their lives. She decided to say nothing. She decided to see how far Paul would go. She decided to find out, once and for all, whether the man she had divorced for his financial rigidity was truly the person she believed him to be, or whether she had simply been wrong about him all along. She told herself it was about John. She told herself it was about wanting to know the truth of Paul's character before her son finished university and entered the world. She told herself a lot of things that allowed her to keep quiet, fold Marcus's first envelope of subsidy money into her desk drawer, and wait. That was the beginning of it. That was the moment the House of Glass was first constructed, built on a foundation of manufactured crisis, held together by a silence that one person chose and another person never knew existed. Paul did not tell John any of this. He did not tell anyone. He went home that night, opened his laptop, and began restructuring his finances with the same methodical focus he applied to every problem in his professional life. He calculated what Diana's rent cost. He calculated what he was currently spending on himself each month. He found the gaps. He started filling them. The first cut he made was to his own rent. He had been living in a 2-bedroom apartment because he needed the second room for when John stayed over during university breaks. He moved into a 1-bedroom and arranged a fold-out sofa for John's visits, telling his son that he was downsizing for simplicity, and watching John nod with the easy acceptance of someone who has not yet learned to read the weight behind casual words. The second cut was to his food budget. Not dangerously. Paul was too practical for that at first, but meaningfully. He stopped eating at restaurants. He stopped buying anything that was not a necessity. He meal prepped on Sundays, cooking large batches of simple, cheap food that could stretch across a week, and he ate the same 4 meals on rotation without complaint, because complaint required acknowledging the sacrifice, and acknowledging the sacrifice would require explaining it to someone, and he had decided that no one would know. The third thing he did was take on extra work. His accounting firm allowed him to take on private clients in addition to his regular hours, and he began doing exactly that. Sitting up past midnight doing tax returns and financial audits for small businesses, billing hourly, funneling every extra pound directly into the envelope that went via Marcus's fictional program to Diana's rent. This was October. By December, Paul had developed a dry cough that he attributed to the cold weather and ignored. By the time the first full year had passed, Paul Seaman had become a different version of himself. Not a worse version, exactly, but a thinner one, as though the best parts of him had been slowly sanded down by the relentless friction of 12-hour days and permanent financial anxiety. The weight loss was the most visible change. He had always been lean, but now he was sharp-edged in a way that made people look at him twice, not with admiration but with low-level concern that they could not quite put into words. His suits, which had once fitted him well, had begun to hang. The shoulders sat too wide. The trousers needed a tighter belt. He bought no new clothes because new clothes were not in the budget. The cough had not gone away. It had settled in somewhere deep in his chest and made itself comfortable, announcing itself most aggressively in the early mornings and the late nights, when he was hunched over his laptop, finishing private client work at hours when sensible people were sleeping. He went to the doctor once, in February of that first year, and was told it was likely stress-related, that he needed rest and a reduction in workload. He thanked the doctor, collected a prescription for something that helped mildly, and went back to working 3 jobs. Because that was what it had become by January of the first year. 3 jobs. His regular accounting position, which ran from 8 in the morning to 6 in the evening most days. His private client work, which ran from 9 at night until sometimes 2 in the morning. And on weekends, at the suggestion of Marcus, who had become increasingly troubled by what he was watching his friend do to himself, Paul had taken on a part-time bookkeeping contract for a small logistics company that operated out of a warehouse on the edge of the city. This was physical work, in the sense that it required him to be physically present for long hours in a cold building, sitting on a hard chair in the back office, going through paper invoices and manifests that the company's owner had refused to digitize for reasons that were never made entirely clear. Paul did not complain about any of this. He was not a complainer by nature, and beyond that, there was a part of him, a part he would not have easily admitted to, that found a grim kind of satisfaction in the sacrifice. He was proving something, not to Diana, because Diana did not know it was him. He was proving something to himself. He was undoing, in his own private court of reckoning, the verdict of his marriage. He was demonstrating, to the only judge he truly respected, that he was not the man Diana had believed him to be when she signed those divorce papers. He was not a man who chose money over people. He was a man who would work himself hollow to make sure the people he loved were protected. He just needed to prove it where no one could see him, because that was the only kind of proof that felt real to Paul Seaman. This is the thing about guilt. It is a very expensive fuel. It burns hot, and it burns long, and it powers extraordinary effort, but it does not care about the engine it is running. Paul's guilt about his marriage. About every time Diana had asked for spontaneity and he had offered a spreadsheet instead. About every anniversary dinner where he had mentally calculated the cost of the wine. About every small moment of emotional withholding that he had, in the years since the divorce, slowly come to recognize as his own failure. All of that guilt had found, in this crisis, a perfect outlet. He threw himself into it completely. He did not stop to ask whether this was healthy. He did not stop to ask whether this was sustainable. He simply worked. John noticed something was wrong by the middle of the second semester of his second year. He noticed that the way children notice things about their parents, not all at once, but in accumulated details that suddenly added up. He noticed that when he called his father in the evenings, Paul often sounded tired in a way that went beyond ordinary tiredness. He noticed that Paul had stopped mentioning dinner plans or weekend activities when they spoke, that their conversations had become shorter and more functional. He noticed, when he came home for a short break in March, that his father's apartment felt different. Smaller, somehow, though it was the same size it had always been, and that there was a Spartan quality to it that had not been there before. The fridge was not empty, but it was basic. The flat was clean, but stripped of comfort. John asked his father if everything was all right. Paul told him everything was fine. He told him work was busy, that he was in the middle of a big client project, that it would ease up soon. He said it with a convincing enough steadiness that John, who was 19 and full of his own life, and not yet experienced enough to know what sustained exhaustion looked like on a man, accepted the answer and went back to university. But the doubt stayed with him. It settled in quietly and did not entirely leave. By the second year, John had begun to build a private theory about his father. The theory was not generous. The theory, shaped by 2 years of watching Paul make himself increasingly absent from anything resembling a personal life, was that his father had simply decided that work was more important than people. He knew this was unfair. He knew, on a logical level, that his father had always worked hard, and that hard work was not the same as indifference. But emotion does not operate on logic, and John was young enough and hurt enough, by the canceled plans, by the tired phone calls, by the visible weight loss that Paul kept brushing off with variations of, "I've been busy," to arrive at the conclusion that his father was choosing an empty life over a full one. He did not know, because no one told him, that the empty life was being lived in service of the full one. He did not know that every hour his father spent in that cold warehouse office, every midnight he worked through, every meal he skipped, was being done specifically so that John would never have to sit in a university lecture hall and worry about whether the lights were still on in his mother's house. This is one of the cruelest features of invisible sacrifice. The people it is meant to protect are often the ones most damaged by the secrecy of it. Diana, during this entire period, was doing perfectly well. She had not lost her job. She had never lost her job. She was a senior project manager at a mid-sized consultancy firm, and at the time she made that phone call to Paul, she had been in the middle of negotiating a promotion. She went to work every morning in the same professional clothes she had always worn, sat in the same corner office she had occupied for 3 years, managed her team with the same competent authority that had always defined her professional life, and came home each evening to an apartment that was fully paid for, partly by her own salary and partly, increasingly, by the money that arrived via Marcus's fictional housing program. She did not spend Paul's money. That is an important thing to understand about Diana Lucas. She was not a woman who was using Paul's sacrifice to fund a comfortable life for herself. Every envelope that arrived, every payment that Paul had wrung out of his midnight hours and his skipped meals and his tightening belt, went directly into a savings account she had opened specifically for this purpose. She was meticulous about it. She kept records. She watched the total grow with something that she told herself was satisfaction, but which, in the quiet moments before sleep, felt increasingly like something else. She told herself, regularly, that what she was doing was for John. She told herself that Paul had never truly been tested, that in the years of their marriage, he had never faced a genuine crisis that required him to choose between financial security and the people he loved. And so she had never known, truly, whether he was capable of making that choice. She told herself that a man who was about to become the father of a young adult entering the world deserved to be known clearly, that John deserved to know who his father actually was. She told herself these things, and she believed most of them, and she set aside the parts she did not entirely believe and continued with the plan. She saw Paul once at a Parents' Day event at John's University in the spring of the first year. He had walked across the lawn toward her with a careful smile, and she had noticed, with a lurch of something uncomfortable in her stomach, how much weight he had lost. His face was hollowed out in a way that had not been there 6 months ago. He looked like a man who had been carefully, systematically drained. She had thought very briefly about stopping it then, about pulling him aside and telling him the truth, about ending the experiment before it extracted any more from him. She did not do it. She told herself she needed more time. She told herself 6 months was not enough to know for certain. She smiled at him. They made careful, pleasant conversation, and they stood side by side watching their son receive an academic achievement award. And Diana told herself that she would end it soon. She did not end it soon. There was a day in October the second year, 13 months after Diana's phone call, when Paul did something that he had never done before in his adult professional life. He fell asleep at his desk. Not a doze, not a brief closing of the eyes. He fell into a genuine, uncontrolled, dead-weight sleep in the middle of a client tax file, and he woke up 2 hours later with his face on his keyboard and a string of random characters typed into a cell that had previously contained a carefully calculated depreciation schedule. It took him 20 minutes to find and fix the error, working with shaking hands and a foggy head, and afterward he sat very still at his desk for a long time and looked at himself in the reflection of his darkened monitor. He did not like what he saw. He saw a man who was 51 years old and looked older than that. He saw the shadows under his eyes that had become permanent residents. He saw the thinness that had gone beyond lean and arrived somewhere that concerned him, though he had not yet allowed himself to use words like concerning about it, because using words like that would require taking action, and action would require slowing down, and slowing down was not an option. He got up, drank 2 glasses of water, took his medication for the cough, and went back to work. This is what sustained sacrifice looks like from the inside. It does not look heroic. It looks like a man falling asleep on his keyboard, and then getting up and continuing. It looks like choosing to not use the word concerning about your own declining health, because concern requires attention, and attention requires time, and time is the one thing you cannot spare. It looks like tightening your belt an extra notch and not mentioning it to anyone. Paul Seaman spent 13 months of his life looking like this. He lost 14 pounds. He developed a chronic cough that would take 2 years to fully resolve after he eventually started sleeping properly again. He aged visibly in ways that photographed him before and after this period captured with quiet honesty. He did all of this in service of a crisis that did not exist, in payment for a guilt that had already been more than adequately settled, because a woman he had once loved decided that love, his love, specifically, needed to be tested in a laboratory before it could be trusted. He did not know any of this. He simply worked and coughed and grew thin and told John everything was fine. Listen, if you're still here, it means you're invested. You want to see what happens next. But here's the reality. Most people watch stories like this and scroll away without subscribing. They enjoy it, then vanish. If this story actually matters to you, if you genuinely care about how it ends, hit that subscribe button. It only takes a second. Otherwise, you'll probably forget this channel exists and miss all the other incredible stories I share. The The first crack appeared on a Wednesday evening, 9 days before John's graduation. Paul had finished his regular work hours and was heading home on foot. He had stopped taking the bus the previous year as part of his ongoing effort to reduce expenses, and he had convinced himself the walk was good for him, which was partially true and also partially a useful story. He told himself to make the austerity feel like a choice rather than a constraint. He was walking down Garfield Street, cutting through the commercial district because it was the most direct route, when he saw her. Diana was at a window table at Marchetti's. Paul knew Marchetti's because it was the kind of restaurant he had never been able to justify spending money in, even in the years before his current financial situation. It was an Italian place with white tablecloths and wine that cost more per glass than Paul's current weekly food budget. He knew it because John had mentioned it once, said it was where his mother liked to go for special occasions. Diana was not alone. She was with 4 other people, 3 women and a man, and they were all in work clothes, the kind of smart casual professional attire that said end-of-day drinks rather than special occasion. She was laughing at something, not politely, not performatively, but genuinely. Her head back, her shoulders loose, the kind of laugh that comes from a person who is comfortable and well-fed and entirely at ease with the world. She was drinking red wine. She looked healthy. She looked well-rested. She looked, in the warm light of the restaurant window, like exactly the kind of person who was doing fine. Paul stood on the pavement and looked at this for approximately 4 seconds. Then he continued walking. He spent the rest of the walk home doing what he always did with information that did not fit his current understanding of the world. He found an explanation for it that allowed him to continue without disruption. Diana had told him she was unemployed, but that had been over a year ago. Perhaps she had found a new job and had not mentioned it yet. Perhaps she was hesitant to say anything because she did not want the housing support to be withdrawn before she was fully stable again. Perhaps this was a final round interview dinner, a social obligation with potential new employers. He did not consider the simplest explanation, because the simplest explanation was not one that his mind was currently in a position to entertain. He had spent over a year organizing his entire existence around a single premise, that Diana needed help, and he was providing it. And the human mind does not easily discard premise it has invested 14 months and 14 pounds into. It finds alternatives. It builds scaffolding around the doubt and keeps the original structure standing. Paul went home. He made his Tuesday meal, pasta with a tomato sauce that cost very little and could be stretched across 3 evenings. He worked on a client file until 11:30. He took his cough medication. He went to sleep. He did not call Diana. He did not contact Marcus. He did not allow the image of his ex-wife laughing over a glass of expensive red wine to surface again in any sustained way for the remaining 9 days until graduation. This, more than anything else, tells you everything you need to know about the particular texture of Paul Seaman's love. It was not naive. He was an intelligent man, professionally precise, analytically capable, trained to spot inconsistencies in figures and records. He was not oblivious. Some part of him, on that pavement on Garfield Street, had registered exactly what he was seeing, but he chose, consciously or not, to not follow that thread to its conclusion, because following would mean that everything he had done for the past 14 months had been done for nothing, and he could not afford, emotionally, structurally, to believe that. So he didn't. He filed the image away in the same internal drawer, where all uncomfortable truths go when a person is not yet ready to face them. And he closed the drawer, and he went home to his pasta. There were other slips that Paul had half noticed over the course of the 2 years, and similarly declined to examine. The time Diana had mentioned casually that she had just read a review of a new book that had only been available in hardback, an expensive detail that Paul had registered and then covered over with a quick internal explanation about library copies or generous friends. The time John had mentioned that his mother had just got back from a conference, a piece of information Paul had processed briefly and then attributed to freelance consulting work, which unemployed professionals sometimes did between jobs. The time Marcus had taken slightly too long to respond to a message Paul sent him about the next payment, and had eventually replied with a message that was just slightly more careful in its wording than it needed to be. Paul had noticed the care and told himself Marcus was simply being thorough. Each of these moments was a crack in the glass. None of them, individually, was large enough to break the structure, but they were there A network of fine lines running to the surface, waiting for the single moment of impact that would bring it all down. That moment was 9 days away. The week before graduation, Paul did something that surprised even himself. He went shopping, not for clothes. He was not yet willing to replace his ill-fitting suits, because that felt like admitting something he was not ready to admit about how bad things had gotten. He went shopping for a graduation gift for John. He walked into a watch shop on the high street and stood in front of the glass case for a long time, looking at the options with the careful, measured expression of a man doing serious mental arithmetic. He had put aside a small amount specifically for this. He had planned for it months in advance because he planned for everything in advance. And he stood in that shop and he chose a watch with the same quiet, unhurried deliberateness that he applied to everything in his life. He chose a simple one. Not cheap, because John deserved better than cheap, but not flashy either. A clean face, a good mechanism, something that would last. He paid for it, had it wrapped, and carried it home feeling something close to lightness. A feeling he had not had much access to recently, and which he recognized gratefully as pride. He was proud of John. He was genuinely, deeply proud of the young man his son had become. And despite everything, despite the exhaustion, the cough, and the hollowed-out face, and the suits that didn't fit, and the 14 pounds, and the midnight client files, Paul felt, in the week before graduation, that it had been worth it, that whatever it had cost him. John had finished his degree without the weight of his mother's crisis on his shoulders. That was worth something. That was worth a great deal. He packed the watch in his bag, ironed his best suit, and prepared himself for the end of the 2 years. He had no idea that the end he was preparing for was not the end Diana had planned. John's graduation was held on a Friday in June at a university hall that had clearly been built in a more optimistic architectural era. High ceilings, tall windows, the kind of formal grandeur that made ordinary occasions feel significant and significant occasions feel historic. The weather cooperated. The sky was an uncomplicated blue, the kind of day that insists, regardless of what is actually happening beneath it, on feeling celebratory. Paul arrived early. He sat in one of the wooden chairs lined up in precise rows on the great hall's floor, in his best suit that was no longer his best size, and watched the hall fill with other parents who were better rested and better fed, and who had not, by and large, spent the past 2 years quietly dismantling themselves on behalf of their children. He did not resent them. He simply noticed a difference with the quiet, neutral observational capacity of a man who had grown accustomed to observing differences without assigning them meaning. Diana arrived 20 minutes later and sat 3 seats down from him. She was dressed beautifully. A dark navy dress, a light silk scarf, hair arranged with the kind of effortless precision that actually requires significant effort. She looked, Paul noted with the same neutral observation, extremely well. She had looked extremely well at the Parents' Day of the previous year, too, but he had told himself then that she was simply putting her best face forward, maintaining appearances for John's sake. He told himself the same thing now, though the explanation felt slightly thinner this time, the way all explanations feel when you have applied them too many times to too many inconsistencies. They exchanged polite greetings. They said the kinds of things that divorced parents say to each other at their child's milestone events. Brief, warm, carefully calibrated sentences that acknowledged their shared pride without opening any door that either of them wanted opened. They both looked toward the stage as the ceremony began, and they both sat with a particular stillness of two people who are each, in their own way, waiting for something. John's name was called 40 minutes into the ceremony. He crossed the stage with the slightly self-conscious composure of someone who knows they are being watched by everyone they love and is trying not to trip. He received his degree. He shook the appropriate hands. He looked up once toward the rows of parents, and he found his father's face in the crowd, and he smiled, a real smile, an unguarded one, and Paul felt the tightness in his chest loosen slightly, just for that moment. This was why. This was exactly why. The dinner afterward was at a restaurant that John had chosen. A good one, nicer than Paul would have chosen for himself, but it told John it was John's day, and John should pick, and he meant it absolutely. They were seated at a round table, John, Paul, Diana, and 2 of John's university friends who had been invited to join. The mood was celebratory in that slightly heightened way that major life milestones produce, a brightness that is partly genuine joy and partly relief that a long thing is finally over. They ordered food. They talked about John's plans, a graduate scheme he had accepted, starting in September in London. They talked about the ceremony, about John's friends, about the university town, and what they would and would not miss about it. The conversation was easy and warm, and Paul sat in it with the grateful calm of a man who has been cold for a very long time and has finally stepped somewhere that has some heat. He had no warning. There was nothing in Diana's manner during the dinner that indicated what was coming. She had always been composed. It was one of the things he had admired about her, that stillness she maintained even when she was making large decisions. He had seen it in the solicitor's office when they signed the divorce papers. He was seeing it now, and he was not reading it correctly. When the dessert plates were being cleared and a bottle of Prosecco had been opened, Diana stood up. She did this without drama. Simply rose from her chair with the calm authority of someone who has planned for a moment and has arrived at it on schedule. John looked up, slightly surprised. Paul looked up too. The two university friends, taking their cue from the adults, settled into attentive quiet. Diana raised her glass. She said she wanted to say a few words. She said she was so proud of John, and this she said with sincerity that was obviously real. That could not have been manufactured. That sat in the room with a weight that came directly from the truth. She talked about the young man John had become. She talked about watching him grow through his university years with a kind of grace and resilience that she could only partially take credit for, because much of it was simply John. And then she turned to Paul. She said she also wanted to acknowledge someone else. She said that 2 years ago, she had done something that she was not going to call a mistake, because she did not fully believe it was a mistake, but which she recognized required explanation and probably an apology. Paul went very still. Diana kept her voice steady. She explained, clearly and without excessive ornamentation, what she had done. She explained that she had not, in fact, lost her job, that she had been employed throughout the past 2 years, and had been in good financial health the entire time. She explained that she had recognized Marcus's voice on the phone and had understood, from the first moment, that the housing program was Paul's invention and Paul's money. She said that she had made a choice, in that moment, to say nothing, to allow Paul's gesture to continue, and to observe what kind of man he would be when tested. She said that she had been testing him. She used that word directly, without softening it. She said she had needed to know, before John finished university and entered adulthood, whether Paul was truly the man she had always suspected he could be, or whether the financial caution that had driven them apart was the truest version of him. She reached into her bag and placed an envelope on the table. She explained that she had not spent a single pound of the money Paul had sent, that every payment had gone into a trust account she had established for John, that the total, accumulated over 24 months, came to slightly over £40,000, that the account was in John's name and available to him immediately, and that she was presenting it to him today as a graduation gift from both of them, a foundation for the beginning of his adult life. She said she was proud of Paul. She said he had passed the test with complete and absolute distinction. She said that the man she had divorced for choosing money over people had, in fact, turned out to be the kind of man who would quietly sacrifice everything for the people he loved without ever asking to be recognized for it. She said this not as an apology, but as a verdict, the conclusion of a jury returning after long deliberation. She sat down. The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, Paul Seaman experienced something that he would have struggled to describe accurately if anyone had asked him to. It was not a single emotion. It was an entire architecture of emotion, arriving all at once, the way structures collapse, not gradually, piece by piece, but altogether the whole thing, the moment the central support gives way. He understood what she had said. He was an intelligent man, and his mind processed it immediately, clinically, the way it processed everything, with precision and without delay. He understood that the crisis had not been real. He understood that Diana had known from the beginning. He understood that 2 years of midnight client files, of skipped meals, of a cough that had not gone away, of John believing his father had chosen work over his family, of 14 pounds in ill-fitting suits and falling asleep on his keyboard. He understood that all of it had been, from Diana's perspective, an experiment, a control condition, a variable being observed. He looked at Diana across the table. She was looking back at him with an expression he could not read clearly. It contained pride and nervousness, and something that might have been the beginning of a question, as though she was only now, having delivered her prepared conclusion, beginning to wonder what his answer would be. He looked at John. John was staring at the envelope on the table with an expression of complete and utter bewilderment. The expression of a young man who has just been handed an incomprehensible amount of information simultaneously and has not yet decided which piece of it to address first. Paul put his napkin on the table. He pushed his chair back. He stood up. He did not make a speech. He was not a man who made speeches. And even if he had been, this was not a moment that speech would have helped. He looked at John and told him congratulations, that he loved him, that the watch was in the inside pocket of his jacket, and John should take it when Paul got his coat. He said these things quietly and with the same steadiness he applied to everything, because steadiness was what he had, and he was going to use it. Then he picked up his jacket from the back of his chair, and he walked out of the restaurant. It was raining outside. Not heavily. The kind of rain that does not announce itself, that arrives without drama and simply settles in, the way the most consequential things often do. Paul stood on the pavement outside the restaurant and let it rain on him for a moment. He was not a man who stood in the rain dramatically. He was, as has been established, a man of practical instincts. But the shock of the cold water was useful in that moment because it was real. It was an actual physical sensation that confirmed he was in an actual physical world, and that what had just happened inside that restaurant was an actual real event, and not something his tired, overworked mind had manufactured. He had been tested. 2 years of his life had been a test. He thought about the cough. He thought about the mornings he had woken up so tired that the prospect of getting out of bed had felt genuinely mountainous, and he had gotten up anyway, and gone to work anyway, and come home and worked again, because Diana had needed him. Except Diana had not needed him. Diana had been perfectly well and perfectly employed and perfectly capable of paying her own rent the entire time. He thought about John, about the careful, deliberate conversations in which he had told his son that everything was fine, that work was just busy, that it would ease up soon. He thought about the look on John's face at the Parents' Day, the faint shadow of doubt in his son's eyes that Paul had carried with him for over a year. John had thought his father was choosing work over his family. He had spent 2 years allowing his son to think this, because the alternative would have required explaining why he was working so hard, which would have required explaining about the housing program, which would have required betraying Diana's privacy in her moment of manufactured crisis. He thought about the watch in his jacket pocket, the one careful, planned, quietly loving gesture of a man who had spent 2 years stripping his life down to necessity so that he could save enough for a graduation gift that meant something. He thought about 40,000 pounds. He had not had 40,000 pounds to give. He had extracted that sum, pound by pound, from a life that had been worn down to the structural minimum in the process of extracting it. And Diana had kept it safe. She had not spent it. She had given it to John. He acknowledged this. He held it in one side of the scale and looked at it honestly. Then he put the other things in the other side of the scale. The cough, the 14 pounds. The collapsed suits, the falling asleep at the desk, the 14 months of John thinking his father was a man who chose absence, the image of Diana laughing over red wine at Marchetti's, while he walked home in the dark to pasta and client files, the phone call in October, the shaky voice, the calculated pauses, the performance of a woman in crisis delivered by a woman who was, at that very moment, in the middle of negotiating a promotion. He stood in the rain, and he understood something that he suspected Diana had not fully reckoned with when she designed her experiment. A test, to be ethical, requires the consent of the person being tested. A clinical trial requires informed consent. An exam requires the student to know they are sitting an exam. You cannot retroactively grant dignity to an experiment by revealing its positive results at a graduation dinner. You cannot tell a man that he passed and expect a validation to heal the wound that the testing created, because the wound is not about the result. The wound is about having been the subject, without knowledge or agreement, of someone else's methodology. Paul had loved Diana even after their marriage ended. Not romantically, perhaps, but in the way you love someone with whom you have built a life and shared a child, a love that is quieter and more resigned than passion, but no less real for that. He had responded to what he believed was her crisis because he loved her and because he loved John and because he was, at his core, the kind of man who showed up when the people he loved needed him. Diana had spent 2 years confirming this, and in the process had demonstrated something about herself that the result of her experiment could not redeem. She had confirmed that Paul was a man who could be trusted with love. She had confirmed that she was not a woman who could be trusted with it. John found him outside 15 minutes later. He had brought Paul's coat. He stood next to his father in the rain for a moment without speaking, in the way that people stand together when words are insufficient but presence is not. Paul told him quietly that the watch was in the inside jacket pocket. John found it and held it without opening the box. He asked his father if he was all right. Paul considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. He thought about the honest answer, and he gave it. He said he was not entirely sure yet. He said he thought he would be. He said that John getting the money was a good thing, a genuinely good thing, and that he was glad of it. He said he was proud of John, that part was simple and clean and required no qualification. John said he was proud of Paul too. He said it without elaboration, in the direct, unpolished way that young men express the deepest things. Quickly, before the moment becomes too large to manage. He put his arm briefly around his father's shoulders, and Paul felt the weight of it, and allowed himself to feel it. They stood there in the rain for a little while longer. The graduation dinner was continuing inside. Diana was presumably still at the table, in her navy dress, holding her Prosecco, waiting to find out what came next. The trust fund existed. John's future was more secure than it had been that morning. These things were true, and they were good. And Paul Seaman stood in the June rain in a suit that no longer fitted him, with a cough that had not fully healed, and he understood, with a complete, unambiguous clarity that only arrives after a very long time of not understanding, that he had passed a test he had never agreed to sit, and that no one had the right to give him a grade. In the weeks that followed, Paul did not cut off contact with Diana entirely. He was too practical for that. And John existed, and John would always be the bridge between them that neither of them had the right to burn. But something had changed, something structural, something that could not be replaced with apology or explanation, however carefully constructed. Diana tried. She called him 3 days after graduation, and she said the things that needed to be said, that she was sorry, that she had not fully anticipated the cost of what she had done, that she had told herself it was for the right reasons, but that she understood now that right reasons did not make a wrong method acceptable. She said these things with an honesty that Paul recognized and acknowledged. He told her he heard her. He told her he believed her. He told her, after a pause, that the problem was not her intentions, that he had known Diana long enough to understand that she had believed genuinely, that she was doing something meaningful. The problem was the architecture of the thing. The problem was 2 years of him not knowing. The problem was John thinking his father had checked out, and Paul being unable to correct it because protecting Diana's fiction required maintaining his own. The problem was the cough and the 14 pounds and the desk and the watch and the midnight pasta and everything else that comprised the material reality of a sacrifice made in service of a lie. He told her that he had passed the test. And he told her that he wished, more than he could fully explain, that she had never needed to run it. John opened the box containing the watch on the train back to university. He sat with it in his hand for a long time, turning it over, reading the small engraving Paul had arranged on the back. 3 words, chosen with particular care of a man who does not use words extravagantly and therefore makes each one count. The 3 words were, "You are why." John understood them completely. He put the watch on. He wore it to his first day at the graduate scheme in September, and he wore it every day after that, and when people asked him about it, because it was a good watch, a simple one, the kind that draws the eye without demanding attention, he said his father had given it to him. He said it without further explanation, because the full explanation was long and complicated, and required a kind of honesty about human beings that was difficult to compress into casual conversation. What he knew, wearing it, was this. His father had spent 2 years making himself invisible so that John could stand in the sun. He had done it without being asked. He had done it without being known. He had done it and then walked out into the rain and not made a speech about it, because Paul Seaman was not a man who made speeches. He was a man who showed up. He was a man who worked. He was a man who chose people over everything else when it mattered and said nothing about it afterward and went home and had his pasta. And his son, wearing a watch on his wrist on the first day of the rest of his life, knew this completely and was grateful for it in a way that he would spend the rest of his life finding new reasons to understand. The house of glass did not fall all at once. It fell in stages, as glass tends to, a crack here, a crack there, and then one moment of truth that spread the fracture all the way to the foundation. What was left afterward was not rubble. Exactly. It was more like the aftermath of a house that had been built on sand to begin with. The land was still there. The people were still there, but the structure that had stood between them was gone, and everyone could now see each other clearly, without the distortion of glass between them. Paul put on a little weight that summer. His cough began to improve. He bought one new suit, a well-fitting one, and he stood in front of the mirror in the shop, and he looked at the man looking back at him, and he thought, there you are, still standing, thinner than you should be and older than you feel, and carrying something that will take longer than a summer to fully set down. But there, present, intact, Paul Seaman was a man whose marriage had ended and whose love had been tested, and whose body had paid a price that no result could justify. He was also a man who had, in 2 years of silent and grinding sacrifice, proved something true about himself that no one, not Diana, not John, not even Paul, had previously had occasion to know with certainty. He was the kind of man who stayed, not for recognition, not for reward, not because someone was watching and taking notes. He stayed because it was his nature to stay, and because the people he loved were worth staying for, and because the only verdict that had ever truly mattered to Paul Seaman was the one he delivered to himself, in the quiet of a one-bedroom apartment, at midnight, after client files were done, and the pasta was eaten, and the city had gone dark and still. He had been found sufficient, and, in the end, that was enough. The story of Paul and Diana teaches us that love without honesty is just manipulation wearing a kind face. Diana convinced herself that testing Paul was an act of love, but the truth is that any relationship, whether a marriage, a co-parenting partnership, or a friendship, that requires one person to be deceived in order to prove their worth has already failed its most basic test. Real love does not set traps and call them trials. Real love does not watch someone lose weight, develop a chronic cough, and wear suits that no longer fit, while sitting comfortably in an office knowing it could all be stopped with one honest conversation. The lesson here is double-sided. Paul's sacrifice was beautiful, but it was also a warning. When guilt drives a person to give without limits and ask nothing in return, they become dangerously easy to take advantage of, even by people who mean well. And Diana's revelation, however generously intended, teaches us that you cannot dress a wound you secretly inflicted and call yourself a healer. The most important thing this story leaves behind is this. The people who love you most deserve your honesty first, your tests never, and your truth always, because a love that has to be proven in secret is a love that has already been disrespected in public. So here's the real question. Did you subscribe yet? Thousands of people will listen to this story and won't subscribe. Please don't be that person. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My friend said, I wouldn't even reach 10,000 subscribers. But I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show him that these tales matter. Please subscribe to this channel, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. And here's what I need to know. Do you want part 2?